Hey, it's Russ from the Infectious Groove Podcast, coming at you once again to talk about some of the rare pressings and the stuff that we have down here. I'm actually going to talk about two different pressings of the same record. I try hard not to do that. I've got 4 or 5 pressings of the White Album. I've got 3 or 4 pressings of Bad by Michael Jackson, a couple of different pressings of The Wall. Some of my all-time favorites I've acquired different pressings of for different reasons. So I want to talk to you today about a couple of different pressings of the same record that's kind of rare and hard to find. Or was until very recently. You have Skid Row's second effort, which is a masterpiece of hard rock and metal, Slave to the Grind. Now, original pressings of this record come in a couple of different flavors, and they're all very hard to find. A couple of different reasons you've heard me go on about in these videos. Vinyl in the 90s was hard to find in the first place. At the time that this record came out, the grunge movement had completely stolen the thunder of bands who were growing out of their 80s roots. Bands like Warrant, we talked about their later material being fantastic, and especially Skid Row. The leap in quality of music from the first Skid Row record to the second Skid Row record is enormous, but because grunge had really swept all those bands to the side, a lot of fans feel like this record definitely got the short end of the stick. On top of that, original pressings come in a couple of different flavors because there was some controversy when this record came out about the track listing. Now you'll see here, the one that I have includes the original offensive cut to some, Get the Fuck Out. Now that song was replaced on a couple of different pressings and for mass market here in the US on the digital pressings like the CD with a song called Beggar's Day. That was found at like Walmart and whatnot, but you could walk into your regular record store and find this version on CD that had the original song that was deemed to be too offensive for some retail outlets. So when you find an original of this, you might even find one that has Beggar's Day instead of Get the Fuck Out. You might find one that has that song instead of Beggar's Day. To be honest, I love 90% of this record so much that I took what I could get when I can get it. About 10 years ago, I came into finding an original pressing, and I took what I could when I found it. As far as the actual pressing itself, real nondescript, nothing super exciting here. Again, kind of a product of the day. It came out in 92. Some scuffs and whatnot that came on it. It's a used record. It might have been that way even from the factory, depending on quality control at the time. But very, very generic Atlantic Records. If you've been a fan of any band on Atlantic Records, from Tom Petty, Frank Sinatra, anybody really who's had anything pressed on Atlantic, very, very, even Stone Temple Pilots, their material in the 90s was on Atlantic. A lot of that stuff, just a very generic Atlantic Records label. So the vinyl itself is really nothing special. Again, this was way before the 180 gram craze that came out. So just 120 gram record, but it still sounds fantastic. And if you look, that pressing is pretty beat up and it still sounds fantastic. As far as the inners go, again, very basic. A lot of the lyrics for the record, and then cool picture, which I'm sure didn't get them anywhere with the grunge fans, unfortunately. Fantastic lineup of this band. And a lot of people lament the fact that Sebastian Bach left the band shortly after this. He was on the next record after this, but left. But I'm telling you right now, as big of a loss to Skid Row as Sebastian Bach is this cat right here, robaffuso. Fantastic drummer, and his work is on display through this entire record. Now, a lot of times when I talk about rare pressings, I talk about the aftermarket and how it's really hard to get, and sometimes these records can go for hundreds of dollars. This year, out of all the terrible things that happened in 2020, one thing that happened that was fantastic for Skid Row fans was that out of nowhere, Slave to the Grind received a repress for Record Store Day. I'm certain that some of these are already on the aftermarket, but if you can get one of these sooner than later, if you really want this record, definitely pick this up. There's a couple of things that I really, really like about the repress, and I'll show you one thing. I'll stop off and show you the inner. It's very, very similar, except they moved the picture of the band. It's all just the lyrics here. They moved the picture of the band from the inner sleeve into the gatefold, which they did that because the repress of this is now on 2 LPs instead of 1. and so it didn't have a gatefold in the first place, and now it does. Some cool art direction here, I think. I think they did a good job, especially with a record that wasn't as popular as it could have been. But as far as the track list goes, what's great about this is on the first LP and a half, you do get the original track list that I showed you on the original pressing, but there's a second LP in here that has some rarities in it. So you get Beggar's Day, which I was missing from the one, or if you have a pressing with that, you were missing the other song. You get that all included. There's a couple of live tracks on here, including a cover of Delivering the Goods by Judas Priest. So that's pretty rad. Both of these records are pretty close to the same, but there's one thing I do want to show you is they're both on red vinyl, which I think is kind of cool. And they've nixed the original Atlantic Records inner that I was showing you on the original and did more of like a faded version of the album cover, which is kind of cool. They also use the opportunity of the two LPs to spread the record out a little bit. So if you're familiar with inner groove distortion, you don't get that on this pressing because everything is spread out over the original record, spread out over 3 sides, with the 4th side being reserved for the extra tracks, which is kind of cool. This is very minor, but one thing I do want to point out too, they did a very good job with this sleeve. Really thick cardboard, which when you have a record like this that wasn't as popular as it should have been and really is a cult thing, when you are a fan like me and you hear this is getting repressed, you think you lower your expectations. You think it's going to be kind of the lowest end, you know, barely in a sleeve maybe. And not only did they put it in the gatefold, they put it in a really thick cardboard glossy gatefold, which is really nice. It shows some respect for the music that's found in here. And then on top of that, you notice I didn't have to re-sleeve this because they already put it in rice paper sleeves, which is sweet. I have box sets I've spent almost $1,000 on, and the records inside didn't come in rice paper sleeves. So I thought that was fantastic that they actually did that. So having said that, that is our latest video. If you're not already, make sure you subscribe to the channel. If you're not already listening to the podcast, make sure that you go to your podcast provider and look up Infectious Groove Podcast, subscribe to that, and you'll hear us talk more about stuff like this, Slave to the Grind, Skid Row.